Hi. Probably wondering what I'm doing there. That was my impression of the markets. Maybe that doesn't make any sense. I'll explain. If you watch this clip that I did on Sky News, this might look a little less weird.
I mean, all Western European nations have had to deal with those exact same problems. It's us who uniquely suffered the crisis that we had. I know you said with the canary in the mine, but I mean, look, we are clearly the outlier as things stand in terms of what's just happened. I mean, there was look, from a leftist perspective, you could almost, you'd think somebody like myself would say, well, sod the markets, you should just do exactly what you want to do. In my case, it would obviously have not been huge tax cuts for rich people. It would have been investment in public services. It would have been public ownership, things like that. But you know what? A clever left-wing argument would be to accept, well, actually, we shouldn't have the world in which we live in which markets have been handed far too much control. We should have done what Norway did when they had North Sea oil. They built up a sovereign wealth fund, for example. Singapore's often looked at by libertarian economic supporters, but they have huge state intervention in the economy, state-owned enterprises which actually intervene to invest in things. We haven't done that. So what, John McDonnell, for example, the Shadow Chancellor,
Former
Shadow Chancellor of Labour, definitely not the Shadow Chancellor anymore. A lot of what he did was completely drowned out in the noise in terms of that whole Corbyn period. Because his view was, if you want to do radical things, you can't surprise the markets. So that's why they tried to set out in great detail what they would do. They went on a prawn cocktail offensive in the city. They tried to talk to financiers on a daily basis. And they came up with a fiscal rule, for example, which was you would only borrow to invest. You wouldn't borrow for anything else. So actually what they were trying to do is say, well, look, this isn't the world we would have designed. The markets do have far much control, but that doesn't mean you can't have a radical transformative government that does things in the economy, which a lot of those investors won't like, but as long as they're offered reassurance, as long as they're offered long-term stability, then they won't take fright. This government didn't do that. This government just surprised them. It just went boo to a very angry dog, which then bit it.
So to explain a little bit more about the dog thing going on there, the brilliant economist James Meadway put it to me that you should see the markets as a bit like a dangerous dog. He said, don't make any sort of movements, speak calmly, maintain eye contact, and you can get past them. Now, just to explain a bit more about that, John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor who I mentioned in the clip, so when he was Shadow Chancellor, as I said, he spent a lot of time meeting asset managers, financial advisors, explaining that while there were things in what Labour wanted to do under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell they didn't like, nationalisation, the rich paying a bit more tax, there was lots on investment, so they get investment opportunities out of it. And what they told him is that as long as there was certainty and predictability, they could live with that. They would price in Labour's policies and make sure, as long as they made sure there was no major surprises, so then they could get used to the general thrust and direction of what Labour were going to do. But the other point is, some might look at what happened to Liz Truss and go, well, that justifies austerity, because George Osborne's argument is, unless they cut, they'll spook the markets and then the cost of borrowing will go up. But as the brilliant economist Jonathan Portes put it in the New Statesman, that wouldn't happen, because when George Osborne was Chancellor, as Jonathan Portes puts it, markets were saying borrow and spend, because with demand and investment weak, interest rates were at zero, extra borrowing had almost no impact on long-term rates. So they always conjured up at the time the perspective of the rating agencies downgrading the UK unless austerity was pursued, the credit rating. But that actually happened in 2013, and it didn't have that impact. It had no impact. In fact, gilt rates, which determine the cost of borrowing, actually carried on going down. And Jonathan Portes also notes that the UK entered the pandemic with debt significantly much higher than it was at the beginning of the 2008 financial crisis, but the fiscal response, and therefore the deficit, was bigger. So according to the proponents of austerity, that should have caused a massive crisis, but it didn't. Deficits at the time were maintained by having very low interest rates. The problem now is the change in context, because with inflation very high, and thus higher interest rates, and interest rates predicted to keep going up, more government borrowing means that the expectation is that there'll be faster rate rises and therefore gilt rises go up. So borrowing does have this cost now. So now you kind of think, well, austerity is obviously the only alternative, but obviously it isn't. What needs to happen is the wealthy need to be taxed. That's Labour's choice. You see, Labour could come to power and only marginally increase taxes on the rich. They're talking, for example, about restoring well, they were going to maintain the 45p tax rate, but that's now being maintained by the government. So if they even only margin increase it, but don't do austerity, then they could face what Truss faced in terms of the markets. The other alternative is they implement more austerity. If they do that, they'll be convulsed by social crisis and massive popular anger. People are not going to vote for a Labour government because they think there'll be more austerity. The other alternative is they increase taxes on the rich to avoid this scenario from happening. I hope that makes sense. Thanks for watching. Do hit like and subscribe and the notification bell. Support us on patreon.com/Jose84. I'll see you soon.